One of the things that the Enlightenment, modernity, post-modernity, whatever you want to call it, and simply the sheer passage of time have wiped away from our current consciousness is our supernatural vocabulary. We've lost the language of the supernatural. We don't know how to speak of it meaningfully or with any clarity. Don Cupid, in his book, After God, The Future of Religion, I commend that to you strongly, gives us a little bit of a primer in spiritual vocabulary or supernatural vocabulary so that we can hold this conversation. First of all, how do we define or distinguish soul, spirit, and God, with both a little g and a big G? Simply put, he says that the idea of soul is that animating presence within our physical bodies. It is that which gives our lump of clay or mass of molecules, however one wants to describe it, life, animation, movement, reality. What is it that separates a lump of flesh from a human being? It is that that lump of flesh has a soul that lives within it and gives that mass meaning, movement, life. And so it is also that a soul without a body has no reality or meaning or existence in the traditional sense. Or it is one of those great religious questions. What happens to the soul when it leaves the body? Now, that is not to be confused with a spirit. A soul does not become a spirit. Spirits, that's a whole thing in itself. Spirits are these disembodied, they don't have bodies, disembodied power. These disembodied powers. We think of spirits as angels or as demons. They both belong to the spirit realm. And they do things. They're not known so much by a name or an identity as they are by their function. So an angel is understood as a messenger of God, if it's good news. So if it's good news, then an angel told me. And demons are those spirits that do bad things. So you can speak of someone, even as the Bible does of Saul, or even of people we might know, that they were possessed of a spirit of jealousy. So these spirits have innumerable functions and bring innumerable aspects to the life that we live. And then there are the gods, with a little g. We'll start there. The big G God, that's part 2 of the sermon. Little g gods were the rulers. They were not these free-ranging spirits. See, spirits, they just were all over the place, here, there, and yonder. Gods were residential. Gods were human-like figures who sat enthroned in a stone temple at the heart of an ancient city. And the territory over which this God's writings and words and people extended was the extent of that God's domain. So wherever the people who believed in that God were, and wherever the words that were attributed to that God had meaning, that was that God's domain. And the fundamental function of such a God was to bind a holy people to their holy land. He describes these elements as the elements of the beginning of religion. Somewhere around 7,500 before the Common Era, 10,000 years ago. He talks about the hunter-gatherers being primarily engaged with spirits, because the hunter-gatherers were not residential themselves. They moved around and they encountered all variety of forces within their world. And the way they explained their world to themselves was to attribute these spiritual powers, be they to animals or be they to natural elements, wind or fire. And that was their way of explaining their world so that they could navigate through this very precarious and dangerous world and feel they had some control, some way of knowing that I can get from here to there. If I invoke this spirit or avoid that spirit, I can survive. I can hunt, I can gather, I can feed my family, I can eat, I can drink, and enjoy the toil of my life. But when the hunter-gatherers became citizen farmers, then these spirits that moved around from place to place didn't quite explain their lives. And so they needed a more residential deity. And so the notion of this God that sat at the city square, enthroned in the temple that the people had built and where the people worshiped, was that central and grounding symbol for that community. The throne of the God was the center around which the state was focused. Divine authority was the source of all later forms of public authority. So as human beings in these citizen farmer conclaves developed laws that would govern their relationships and their transactions and their dealings, these laws received the imprimatur of their God. And so whatever was supposed to be done, magically and mystically, was now done because God had ordained it. Sounds very ancient. Sounds like 10,000 years ago, the way people fought. Or does it? We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all people are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Among them, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, otherwise known as eating, drinking, and enjoying our toil. And so we see that this notion of a state grounded by a common belief in a deity has in fact persisted. Even though our very modern experiment that we call the United States of America deliberately tried to separate the established church from the establishment of the government, those very basic human impulses persisted. In fact, the Constitution was written in such a way as to defend this new state against those very selfsame impulses. But yet, they persist. What's really important here, as we think about these ancient cultures and even our contemporary societies, for the ancient people, they were very, very clear that their God that sat at the center of their city square was theirs.